Majority Leader Mitch McConnell, who orchestrated the strategy of blocking former President Barack Obama's Supreme Court pick, called on senators to make sure that the president's nominee is considered fairly.
The Senate stands ready to fulfill its constitutional role by offering advice and consent on President Trump's nominee to fill this vacancy. We will vote to confirm Justice Kennedy's successor this fall.
Senator Chuck Schumer of New York, the Democratic leader, called McConnell out. Let's watch that.
Our Republican colleagues in the Senate should follow the rule they set in 2016, not to consider a Supreme Court justice in an election year. Senator McConnell would tell anyone who listened that the Senate had the right to advise and consent, and that was every bit as important as the president's right to nominate. Millions of people are just months away from determining the senators who should vote to confirm or reject the president's nominee, and their voices deserve to be heard now, as Leader McConnell thought they should deserve to be heard then. Anything but that would be the absolute height of hypocrisy.
But with so much at stake, Senator McConnell doesn't care about right or wrong. He just cares about winning, much like President Trump. For more, I'm joined by Senator Kamala Harris, Democrat from California, member of the Senate Judiciary Committee. This came as a surprise. It came today, but we knew it was coming. Will there be...
On the heels of the Janus decision.
Pardon me?
On the heels of the Janus decision. Yeah.
On federal employees, public employees. Let me ask you, what's it going to look like if he gets his pick? If Trump gets what he wants here? What's the court going to look like for the next 30 years?
We're looking at a destruction of the Constitution of the United States, as far as I can tell, based on all of the folks that he's been appointing thus far for lifetime appointments. He's been appointing ideologues. He has been appointing people who have refused to agree that Brown v. Board of Education is settled law. He has been appointing people who haven't even been found to be well qualified or even qualified by bar associations. So this has got to be one of, and we all need to understand this, to be one of the most serious fights that we have yet to have had with this president. And we cannot relent. We are going to have to fight to the end to make sure that we can do anything and everything that is possible to require this president to choose a consensus pick. Talk to Democrats. The position is going to be filled. But with the track record that he has demonstrated so far, it does not look good. And so we're going to have to put all the pressure that we possibly can to make sure that the person who fills Kennedy's seat is someone who is a consensus pick and who's going to respect the Constitution of the United States and respect the fact that our system is supposed to be about equality for all and justice and fairness and not about the politics and the political games that so far I see that a lot of his nominees are prepared to play.
Mitch McConnell, the Republican leader, said no to Barack Obama's pick, Merrick Garland, for the whole year. He said, I'm not going to talk to the guy. I'm not going to have hearings. I'm going to let any of my people talk to him. And he won, because now you got Neil Gorsuch. Are you guys going to play hardball this time and say, we're not going to let you pass this? You're not going to rush this through us in a few months before Election Day?
Based on every conversation I've had with my colleagues so far this afternoon, everybody's prepared to play hardball.
Can you push this off till after the election so that we can take this matter to the people?
We're going to have to fight to push it off, because, listen, unlike Merrick Garland, where there were 8 months left in that term, this is 4 months. We're 4 months away from an election. Yeah. 1/3 of the United States Senate practically is up for election. The decision that we make is going to have generational impact. And the American people should be able to weigh in on who will be in this position on the United States Supreme Court. And let's remember, Chris, this is not like Gorsuch, where Gorsuch was about one conservative replacing another conservative. And we fought on that when I voted against him. But he's there. He replaced Scalia. This is about a swing vote. This is a different seat. This is a different seat, and everything lays in the balance in terms of how this court could swing on everything from choice, Roe v. Wade, to what we did in terms of same-sex marriage, to so many issues that are about fundamental rights and about respecting the Constitution of the United States. So this is not like Gorsuch.
Yeah.
This seat will have generational impact, and let's all be clear about this. The decisions made by the United States Supreme Court make decisions about who we are as a country and who we can be and who will be where in this country. Had the United States Supreme Court, under the leadership of Earl Warren, a Californian, not decided Brown v. Board of Education, I would not be sitting here talking with you right now.
Let's talk about the heart we're going to lose here, because Justice Kennedy, although he was a conservative, he was a Northern California conservative. So I sort of get that. Yeah. In other words, he was a bit of a live and let live guy. He believed, he found in the Constitution, the way that the landmark decisions always find in the Constitution, something really wonderful. He found in it, not just like in Warren found, the injustice of separate but equal, the essential injustice of it. Right. He found in it the Liberty Clause. He found in it the essential constitutional protection for people to have same-sex marriage, to have not to be stopped by an undue burden to make a choice about reproduction. He found in it that essential American liberty that we treasure. Do you count on anybody Trump picking doing that?
There is a way that can happen, and that's bring a consensus pick. That's what happened with Merrick Garland.
A pro-choice conservative?
President Obama consulted with Republicans. This president should consult with Democrats and choose a consensus pick, and anything less than that would be unacceptable, entirely unacceptable, and is something we should fight tooth and nail against.
The new trick, it used to be you picked a Supreme Court. Just unfortunately, they were all white males for years. Occasionally, they had a Jewish seat, so-called, but they were older men. Right now, it's like pick somebody as young as you can, fresh out of law school, give them maybe 10, 15 years to show which way they're going politically, and then jam them on that court like Clarence Thomas for 40, 50 years. So when you pick this next person, man or woman, whatever, they'll be there much of this century.
You're exactly right. This will have generational impact. This will have impact on issues that we decide in terms of discrimination, who will have equal opportunity, who will have equal rights under the Constitution and under the law. This is one of the most important powers that a president has. This is why the Federalist Society for decades have been creating this roadmap for decades to make sure that precedent is built up toward the United States Supreme Court making decisions that are going to be about choice as we go forward, about issues that relate to immigration, issues that relate to fundamental rights. And to your point about Kennedy, he understood that on same-sex marriage. He understood it's a fundamental right, marriage. There are so many issues that this court decides that goes to the heart of what we value as Americans and what we decide should be the personal rights and liberties of individuals. This has potential disastrous consequences.
How do you think a right-wing, if you will, a rightist judge coming in now as a number 5 on the court, on the conservative side, outweighing or outcounting, outvoting the 4 liberals, what would they do to Roe v. Wade? How do you see it, them dismembering it? What would it look like?
So what it would look like is this. It would look like the various states that have already been passing legislation at a state level to restrict a woman's access to health care, to reproductive health, to abortions, affirming those rules, those laws that are passed by the states. That
like it has to be a hospital, something like that.
It has to be, or the zone of safety, or in terms of at what term, what stage in the pregnancy a woman can have an abortion or not, what parental consent, whether a woman has to, if she is 17, a young woman, does she have to have parental consent before she can have an abortion? All these are laws that are being created at the states right now.
Yeah, and
it would go then to the United States Supreme Court that would affirm those restrictions on an ability that a woman has to have an abortion or to have access to reproductive health care. And that could be, again, disastrous because it would essentially undo the protections that women currently have under Roe v. Wade.
Let's look at these 2 contestants at the top. Your party leader, Chuck Schumer, a smart guy. Yeah. He's been around a while in both houses. You've got Mitch McConnell, who's a wily character. You don't have to like him to know what he's up to. He manages to get reelected all the time. Yeah. Who's better at parliamentary procedure? Can your party get enough strength?
Chuck Schumer every day.
You have enough strength to be able to hold this vote off at least till the voters have voted in November?
Listen, I think that Chuck is an incredible leader, and he cares deeply about this issue. I've actually talked with him today about it. He's reaching out to all of us because he knows how critical this is, and he's going to need all the soldiers on the field. And I believe that he is committed to this, and he is going to fight to the end to make sure that the right thing happens.
What's going on in the Democratic Party? Just, I know you're a progressive and you're young and you're new. In many ways, you're new, even though you've had a political history of some real substance as Attorney General. Yeah. I saw that election. I know all elections are local. I know Tip always said all things local, but I don't think everything's local. That young woman, Hispanic woman, was able to knock off a name brand product of this country, Joe Crowley. What's going on? She's 28 years old. What's going on?
What's going on is that I'm seeing it around the country. There are people who have never run for political office. A lot of them are women.
Yeah.
Who are deciding that their voices are not being heard, their voices are not present, and they are getting out there, they're showing courage and determination, and they're putting themselves out there, they're running for office, and they're winning.
Yeah, Ocasio.
I think it's a great thing.
Well, we're all going to know her name within a week because it's a powerhouse election. I do, if I were in the leadership, I'd be thinking what you just said. People want change. They want things to move on.
Well, what they want is they want leaders who are going to be courageous enough to speak truth, no matter how unpopular it may feel at the moment. They're going to want people who are elected. The voters want people to run for office, and they're going to elect people who have the courage to speak truth no matter how uncomfortable it makes other people feel, because that's what we need right now. We've got a lot of people in our country who are very distrustful of their government, its institutions, and its leaders. And one of the best ways that we develop relationships of trust is we speak truth. And that's what I think we're seeing around the country. People are putting themselves out there because they're courageous enough to speak truth, and they're winning.
I hope you can stop this nomination before the election. I think the voters should be heard from. I think it should be taken to the voters.
I agree with you.
A 30-year decision. They ought to have some say in it.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me, or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.